Imagine you're sitting in front of a campfire. The wind whispers through the trees, while the flames dance with a warm glow that barely manages to hold the darkness at bay. It's on nights like these, when nature's cold mixes with an unsettling silence, that the most terrifying stories come to life. There's something in the woods, something ancient, primal. Something that has been watching us since time immemorial. It is said that when hunger and desperation consume a man, he can transform into a creature, an entity with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. That being is the Wendigo. The Algonquian tribes have been telling stories about it for centuries. A malevolent spirit, with a gaunt body and hollow eyes, always hungry, always searching for its next victim. But these are not just legends told by the warmth of a fire. These are warnings. What would you do if, while walking alone in the woods, you felt a presence following you? And what if that voice you hear in the distance isn't human? Today, I'll share with you 3 real stories. 3 terrifying encounters with the Wendigo that will make you think twice before venturing into the darkness of the forest. Are you ready? Because after this, the shadows will never be the same. First story, the voice in the night. The wind blew through the trees, making the leaves whisper as if they were sharing some ancient secret. That was the first night I felt it, this strange sensation of being watched. There were 5 of us, camping deep in the woods, far from any trace of civilization. The idea was to get away from everything, enjoy nature, tell stories by the campfire. You know, the usual, right? But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. At first, it was just a feeling. That silent discomfort you can't explain, but it clings to you like a shadow. I didn't mention it. No one did. After all, we didn't want to ruin the experience. We had planned this trip for weeks, and the last thing we wanted was to seem paranoid. Besides, what's the worst that could happen in a peaceful forest like this? As the sun started to set, we lit the campfire. We sat in a circle, chatting, laughing, enjoying the crackling of the fire and the starry sky. Then Jorge, one of my best friends, stood up. He said he needed to go to the bathroom and wouldn't be long. We smiled at each other, since a walk to nature always brought awkward jokes. We watched him disappear into the trees, his flashlight swinging in the darkness, and went back to our conversation. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. 30. More time passed than we expected, and we started to worry. Jorge wasn't the type to get lost easily. We decided to call out for him, but the only echo we received was that of the forest, empty, silent. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and told the others I'd go look for him. Walking alone in the dark had never been my strong suit, but something inside me that night told me I shouldn't leave him alone. I called his name over and over. Jorge. I repeated, but the silence was deafening. Then, I heard a crack to my right. I quickly turned my flashlight, expecting to see my friend, but there was nothing, just more trees and more darkness. The wind picked up, carrying with it a murmur I couldn't make out, and suddenly, I heard his voice. Over here, man. Jorge called, his tone calm, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound like him. It was higher pitched, like he'd been shouting, or as if it were someone else. Where are you? I asked, straining my eyes, trying to find him among the shadows. His voice came again, closer this time, but without the clarity you'd expect. Here, keep walking. The unease in my chest started to build. My flashlight lit up the trees, but the voice wasn't coming from anywhere visible. I began walking toward the sound, my feet crunching dry leaves and branches, when suddenly, I saw something. A few meters ahead, a figure moved between the trees. Jorge, I thought. Finally. But as I got closer, the air grew inexplicably colder. I'm coming. I shouted, but he didn't respond. He just kept moving, slowly, like he was in a trance. Finally, I saw him clearly. There he was, standing still, but facing away from me. Jorge, I called, and something in my voice must have sounded strange, because instead of turning around, he froze completely. The silence in the air was absolute. The forest had stopped breathing. I took another step, and just as I was about to touch his shoulder, I heard his voice from behind me. "Man, I'm over here." My heart stopped. The figure in front of me couldn't be Jorge, because his voice had come from somewhere behind me. My breathing quickened. The flashlight in my hand started to shake. Whatever was in front of me wasn't human. I slowly backed away, not taking my eyes off the motionless figure, and when I was far enough, I turned toward the voice behind me. There was Jorge, standing with a confused expression on his face. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked. I explained what had happened, my voice barely a whisper, while still glancing back to where that figure had been. But when we both looked, there was no one. No figure, no sound. Just the whisper of the wind through the trees. We hurried back to camp, trying to shake off the feeling that something, or someone, had been watching us. The others asked what had happened, but we decided not to give them all the details. We didn't want to scare them. However, that night, none of us slept well. The fire slowly died down, and in the middle of the darkness, we heard it again. A voice. The same voice I had heard before, but this time it wasn't just Jorge. It was the voice of each of us, calling out from somewhere in the woods. "Come, here," it whispered. "I'm lost." Every time we tried to figure out where it was coming from, it would fade away, as if the forest itself was mocking us. In the end, we zipped up the tents and tried to ignore it. But no one can truly ignore what they don't understand. The next day, we packed up and left. No one mentioned what had happened, but we all knew we had shared something more than just a night of camping. Something had followed us, and it had used our voices to do it. I don't know what that thing in the woods was, but I know it wasn't human. And even now, when the wind blows strong at night, I can't help but remember that voice that wasn't mine. Second story, The Lost Explorer. The silence of the forest at night has always carried an unsettling weight. Every time I've gone out exploring, it's reminded me that no matter how much we think we know the world, there are ancient, wild forces we can't control. I understood this better than ever the night we lost Daniel. Daniel was the kind of person who seemed fearless. We met at a hiking club, and he immediately stood out for his boldness. Always willing to go further, to explore trails no one had walked before. To him, nature was a refuge, a place where he could disconnect from the chaos of the city. That confidence he had, however, is what led us to that fateful trip. We had planned to hike deep into a dense forest, in a remote region few knew about. Daniel had heard stories of old hunters who had gotten lost there, tales the locals whispered as warnings. They spoke of a creature that stalked those who ventured too far into the heart of the forest. But, of course, Daniel didn't believe in those stories. To him, they were just tales to scare tourists. And though I wouldn't admit it, something about those stories disturbed me. We set off early in the morning, backpacks full of supplies, excited for a new adventure. During the day, the forest was majestic. The trees were so tall they seemed to touch the sky, and the ground was covered in a soft layer of moss. We walked for hours, following maps that felt more like legends than reliable guides. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The shadows grew, and with them, a heavy feeling, almost tangible, that I couldn't shake from my thoughts. By dusk, as we were searching for a place to set up camp, Daniel decided he wanted to explore a bit further. "I won't be long," he said, flashing that carefree smile he always wore. I knew something wasn't right, but before I could say anything, he had already ventured deeper into the forest, disappearing among the trees. 20 minutes passed, then 30. My instincts told me we needed to go after him. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about the stillness of the place, the way the wind had stopped blowing, that put me on edge. We called out for him. "Daniel," we shouted, but there was no response. Just the empty echo of our own voices. Finally, we decided to go after him. The darkness was almost total, and our flashlights barely lit up the trunks of the trees, which seemed to be silently watching us. As we walked, I felt a growing sense of disorientation. The forest looked the same in every direction, and the branches cracked underfoot as if something else was walking with us. I began to notice strange marks on the trees, as if someone or something had scratched the bark. Probably animals, I thought, trying to calm myself, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Then, we heard it. In the distance, the sound of fast but erratic footsteps. It must be Daniel, I said, though I wasn't so sure inside. We followed the sound, but the closer we got, the stranger it became. The footsteps seemed to be everywhere, sometimes ahead of us, sometimes behind. It was as if the forest was toying with us. Finally, we saw a figure. In the faint moonlight, we could make out someone standing still in the distance. "Daniel!" I shouted, but there was no response. We quickened our pace toward him, but something about his posture was off. He seemed rigid, unnatural. When we finally reached him, what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. It wasn't Daniel. It was a man, or what was left of him. He was dressed in old, tattered clothes, as if he'd been there for decades. His eyes were open but vacant, staring blankly into the horizon. My heart raced. Who was this man? How had he gotten here? Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard a whisper. Low, guttural, coming from the trees around us. It was as if the forest itself was speaking, or something else. Suddenly, I understood. The stories we had heard weren't just legends. Something was hunting in this place, something ancient and hungry. We backed away, trying to get out of there as fast as we could, but the path back seemed endless. Every shadow felt like a threat, and every sound kept us on edge. Then, we saw him. Daniel, or what was left of him. He stood a few meters away from us, with the same empty eyes as the man we had found earlier. But there was something more. His face wasn't the same. There was something deformed, twisted about his expression, as if the forest had claimed him, as if he was no longer himself. I don't know how we did it, but we ran. We ran like never before, feeling something chasing us, something we couldn't see, but knew was right behind us. We didn't stop until we were out of the forest, until the light of dawn wrapped around us, making us feel, for the first time in hours, that we were safe. We never saw Daniel again. The next day, a search party was organized, but they found nothing. It was as if he had disappeared without a trace. But I know the truth. The forest took him, claimed him. And every time I hear a branch snap in the dark, I can't help but think of him, of his face, of the creature that perhaps still wanders that place, waiting for someone else to get lost. Third story, the forbidden ritual. Sometimes, there are places that seem at peace. Quiet, surrounded by nature, almost as if time has not touched them. But behind that apparent calm, some hide dark stories, secrets that should never be revealed. I learned that lesson the hard way. It all started when my friend, Miguel, mentioned an old rumor about a ritual. We lived in a small town, surrounded by mountains and forests, and since we were kids, we had heard stories about a cave at the top of one of the most remote hills. According to the village elders, that cave had been used by past generations to perform an ancient ritual, something that had been buried in the collective memory of the village, almost forgotten, but not entirely. Miguel was obsessed with the mystery. He was fascinated by local legends, especially those dealing with the supernatural. So, one day, he suggested we go to the cave and find out if the ritual was real. At first, I refused. There was something about those stories that had always given me chills. They said that those who attempted the ritual never returned the same. But Miguel insisted. And, as always, his enthusiasm eventually rubbed off on me. It was autumn, and the wind was blowing with a force that seemed to carry with it the echoes of the past. We climbed the hill at sunset, with backpacks full of flashlights, ropes, and some food, although deep down, I knew it wouldn't be necessary. We weren't going to stay long, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. When we reached the cave, the sunlight was fading fast, turning the sky a deep orange that made everything seem surreal. The entrance to the cave was smaller than I had imagined, covered in moss and almost hidden by vegetation. It didn't seem like a place where anyone would perform a ritual, but there was something in the air, something heavy, a feeling that we had crossed an invisible line. "This is amazing," said Miguel, his eyes shining with excitement. To him, this was just another adventure. For me, the knot in my stomach only tightened. We ventured into the cave, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind of silence you find in nature's tranquility, but a dense silence, as if the cave itself was waiting for something. The walls were cold and smooth, and as we walked deeper, the air grew heavier, almost oppressive. After a few minutes of walking in the dim light, we arrived at a large chamber. The floor was covered in dust, and in the center were what looked like carvings etched into the rock, forming a perfect circle. Miguel turned on his flashlight and examined the carvings closely. "This is what I was looking for," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if he didn't want to break the sacred silence of the place. At first, I thought they were just simple symbols, ancient but harmless. However, the more I observed them, the stranger they became. They seemed to shift, distort under the light, as if they didn't want to be understood. Then, Miguel pulled an old notebook from his backpack. He explained that he had found references to this ritual in an ancient book, a sort of grimoire. I hadn't paid much attention to him before, but now, seeing him unfold it so carefully, something inside me began to scream that this was a bad idea. "We just need to follow the instructions," Miguel said, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. I watched him move quickly, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. He began placing small objects within the circle, black candles, a handful of dirt, and a wooden figurine that I didn't recognize. He had brought all of this without my knowledge. I stood still, unable to stop him. Part of me wanted to run, but another part, the more curious one, kept me there, watching. When he lit the candles and stood in the center of the circle, something changed in the atmosphere. The air grew even heavier, as if the cave had started to breathe with us. And then, Miguel began to recite some words. At first, I didn't understand them. They sounded like an ancient language, forgotten by time. But the more he spoke, the more I felt that those words should not be spoken. There was a resonance to them, a vibration that made my bones tremble. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet began to shake slightly. I thought it was my imagination, but when I saw the fear in Miguel's eyes, I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. "Stop!" I shouted, but it was too late. The ground within the circle cracked open, and a freezing wind blew out from the fissure, snuffing out the candles in one swift motion. The silence that followed was deafening. The air smelled of damp earth, of something old and rotten. But the worst part wasn't that. The worst part was what appeared before us. From the crack, a figure emerged. It wasn't fully visible, like a shadow that didn't belong to this world. Its eyes, they weren't eyes at all. They were empty, black voids that seemed to absorb the little light left in the cave. And the worst part was its face, a grimace of eternal pain, as if it was trapped in endless suffering. Miguel stood frozen, unable to move. I, on the other hand, backed away, but I couldn't take my eyes off that thing. It was watching us, or at least that's what it felt like. And then, it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that echoed in my mind, a voice that wasn't of this world. "You have awakened what should never have been awakened," it whispered, and at that moment, I knew there was no going back. The figure moved toward Miguel, slow but inevitable. I tried to scream at him to run, but he was frozen in terror. Before I could do anything, the figure enveloped him in its shadows, and the last thing I heard was his scream, a sound that even today, years later, haunts my nightmares. I don't know how I did it, but I ran. I fled from the cave, from the hill, from the forest. I never saw Miguel again. No one did. When the authorities organized a search, they found no trace of him. Just the empty cave, as if he had never been there. Since then, I avoid stories about rituals and legends. Some doors should never be opened, and some truths are better left unknown. After everything we've heard tonight, it's hard not to feel a shiver run down your spine, right? Stories about the Wendigo, forbidden rituals, and shadows lurking in the darkness always leave us with more questions than answers. And maybe that's the key. Perhaps there are things we simply aren't meant to understand. Mysteries better left untouched, beyond the reach of our curiosity. What I've learned after hearing so many legends and tales is that not everything has a logical explanation. Sometimes, the unknown is just that, unknown. And when we try to unravel it, we face things that defy our comprehension, forces that have existed long before we came into this world. Think about it. How many times have you felt a presence in an empty place? Or heard a sound you couldn't explain, only to convince yourself it was the wind, or maybe your imagination? Maybe those sensations are more than just coincidences. Maybe they're the warnings left by old legends, like the Wendigo, reminding us that there's a boundary between our world and theirs. And that crossing that boundary may come with consequences. But on the other hand, it's also fascinating, isn't it? We're drawn to these stories because, deep down, we like the danger. We like exploring the unknown, even though we know we might not like what we find. It's that mix of fear and curiosity that drives us to tell and listen to these tales, keeping the flame of mystery alive. And here we are, at the end of our little journey through these dark stories. If anything has become clear to me, it's that fear, though uncomfortable, is also a sign that we're alive, that our instincts are still alert, protecting us from whatever might be lurking. But now, with the fire nearly out and the night growing deeper, it's time to leave these stories behind, at least for today. Before we go, I'd love to know what you think. Do you believe there's some truth in these tales, or do you think they're just a product of our imagination? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm sure more than one of us has had a strange experience, something that, no matter how hard we try to forget, always comes back on those quiet nights when the darkness feels a little heavier. In the end, the important thing is that these stories make us feel, think, and, above all, connect. They remind us that, even though the modern world tries to convince us we've seen it all, there are still dark, hidden corners where mystery is alive. And maybe, just maybe, we should respect those spaces and not try to unravel them. Because sometimes, it's better to leave the unknown in peace. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember, the shadows are always closer than you think.